Welcome to the Brass Hand Woodwind Shop. In the last video I diagnosed the problems with the valves on this French horn. This French horn is over 100 years old. The valves have been used a lot over the years and they are very loose. To get the valves replated and refit would be extremely expensive, so one of my customers was wondering if it could be done less expensively. So I took up the challenge and decided to give it a try, although I've never done anything like this before. I have tightened up rotor valves so that they will work better, and I've even done a few videos on that, but I have never tightened up the face of the valve. It is not that hard to tighten up the bearings around the spindles so that the valve will rotate better. However, it is hard to add material to the face of the valve so that it will leak less. That is what I'm going to try to do on these valves. After I published the first video about diagnosing the valve problems, there was a lot of discussion about how it could be fixed. There was one very interesting comment that got me to think a lot about this repair. It was from Andy King. This might sound crazy, but if you could get the valve cores to take a bit of solder and then polish them down a bit in a lathe, they might just tighten up enough, although solder is pretty soft. And then in response to this, the person who owns this French horn replied, "That does sound like a great idea, but I think it might be difficult to get a thin, even coat of solder." And then someone replied to that, "Getting a thin, even coat of solder should normally not be too difficult. You need to clean the base material really well, apply a good coat of flux, then heat evenly and apply the solder. Using a solder pot and rotating the valve in the solder would be the ideal way rather than a torch and bar solder, but either would work." And then he adds, "But these are two-part valves and quite possibly soldered. It would be really bad if you melted these joints when trying to solder plate the valves. This is a case where heat is most likely not your friend." These suggestions and responses were very well thought out and interesting, and it got me to thinking about these repairs. And this is what I love about band instrument repair, because you never know what you're going to run into, and you see new things all the time that you've never seen before. So I'm going to do some experimenting. However, I do not experiment on customers' instruments, so I have a valve right here, and I am going to experiment on that first and see what happens, and then I will use the knowledge from that to work on this instrument. At first it may not sound like a good idea to use solder on bearings. However, lead is used in bearings on electrical engines, and it does seem to hold up pretty well. So the idea of using solder is not that crazy, and it is something to consider. I thought that it might be a good idea to use a base coat of solder, put the solder on, even it out, and then after that plate it with either nickel or silver plating. I was originally wondering if you could add enough plating on this with a spot plater to get it to build up to the point where it would not leak. And also if you could get the plating even enough to do that. You might be able to build it up with the nickel plating. However, nickel plating is a lot harder, and if it's not even, then it would be difficult to work with. Silver plating is a lot easier to work with, but it would probably take a long time to build it up enough. If I can put some solder on here to build it up and then plate it, that very well may work. That may work on the face of the valve, but I also have the spindles, which are very loose, and those are going to be harder to do that with. Now normally I would use this tool. This is a French horn bearing tool, and it works very well on most French horn rotors to tighten up the spindles. If you want to learn more about this tool, look in the description below for links to other videos that I did on this tool. What you would do is put the bearing in there, and then you would tighten up the tool. And what it does is it tightens down that little circular part of the bearing, and it tightens it down to the spindle of the rotor, and that tightens it up. Normally I would use the tool to tighten up these bearings, but they are so loose that this tool probably would not work well. You can also use this tool to tighten up the bearings on the other side of the casing on the horn. This tool works very well to tighten up the spindles of the rotor, but it does not work on the face of the valve. This tool will not work well on this repair, so I'm going to put that away and I will use it on my next repair. About the valves being two-piece valves, this valve was brazed together right around the middle. Brazing melts at a higher temperature than solder, so I think these will be okay if I do not overheat them too much. What I'm going to do for the face of the valve is put solder on it and then put plating over the solder. For the spindles, I have to do something else though. These spindles, I'm going to hold this up to the camera. They are not round at all. It looks like somebody filed the valves down. There are several gouges and marks on there. So what I'm going to do on the smaller spindle is I'm going to grind these down to make them round. They're going to be smaller. So what I'm going to do is take a brass rod and then drill out the brass rod to fit over the spindle. Then I'm going to cut off the part of the brass rod and solder it into the bearing plate. That way there will be a tight fit between the spindle and the bearing plate. The only possible problem I can think of with the solder on the valve is if any technician is ever working on this instrument and they need to heat up either a valve or near a valve, it could make a big mess inside of the instrument. So if the player ever takes it to a repair shop, he needs to let them know that the valve does have solder on it so that they can be very careful to avoid heating it up. What I'm going to need to do is smooth out these spindles, so I'm going to do something that's similar to the way they would do it at the factory. What they do at the factory is hone the valves down. They have two stones and they put them parallel to each other, or if they want to, they can put it at a slight angle if they need to make tapered valves. What I'm going to do is take my sharpening stones and make something to hold them so that they can evenly cut the spindles on the valves. These sharpening stones are ones that you'd use to sharpen knives with. I have a brass rod that's almost the same size as the spindle. I'm going to put that right on there and then put the other stone on top of that. And to keep these from rubbing together, I'm going to put a piece of cloth there. Then I'm going to put some of this material around there, like that. Then I'm going to use a hose clamp to hold this together. Here's my honing tool. I put the rod in there to keep the stones about as far as they should be apart when I am honing the spindle. I put the material in here to keep anything from getting damaged, and the hose clamp is to hold everything together, and the cloth is to keep the stones from rubbing against each other. The stones are parallel this direction. They are not parallel this way, and that's so that I can open it and close it as I need to hone the spindles of the valves down. When a valve is honed, it needs to be turned at a very slow rate of speed. Here's my little benchtop lathe. When you're honing a valve, you want it at a very slow speed, so I put this at the slowest speed that there is, but it still may not be slow enough. I'm going to turn this on and see if it's too fast or not. Yeah, that's still way too fast. I'm going to have to slow it down more. I have a dimmer switch that I hooked up to a plug. I made this a few years ago for something else, but I'm going to use it for the lathe right now to slow it down a little bit. I have the lathe plugged into the dimmer switch. I'm going to turn this on and then slow it down. Okay, that's probably about a good speed there. It's going very slowly. Because I am experimenting, I do not want to use the customer's instrument, so I was going to use this valve, but the problem is that the spindle is recessed too far into the valve on this one. So I got another junk French horn, and this one will be far easier to work with. Then I took a file and I filed down the spindle, and the reason I did that is to simulate what the other instrument that I'm working on looks like. And now I'm going to take this valve and chuck it in the lathe so that I can work on it. I need to make sure it's in there evenly so that when it spins, the spindle is on center. That looks good, so I think we're about ready to go. So what I'm going to do is take some oil and put it on the sharpening stones. What I'm going to do is take the stones, open them up a little bit, and put them onto the spindle with a little bit of pressure. What that's going to do is it's going to help grind these down to make them parallel and round. Here. Okay, let's see what happened. Because the stones are parallel and the spindle is tapered, it started working on the inside of the spindle, but not the outside. So what I'm going to need to do is hone this down for a while. When I am done, this will be cylindrical, and that's okay, because the bearing that I'm going to make to go over it is going to also be cylindrical. I'm going to start this up and hone it down some more. What I found so far is that these do a very good job of smoothing it out and making them parallel. The only problem is that they're cutting so slowly that it's going to take a very long time to smooth it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the file to cut it down a little bit faster. Then I'm going to use the stones to do the final cut and make sure that they're parallel and round. Experimenting and trying new things can be fun, but it can also be a little bit frustrating. There are a lot of little problems I ran into in the course of making this video, but that is why I do the experiments, and also that is why I experiment on my own instruments and not someone else's instruments. One thing that I found that I'm going to need to do is leave the spindles tapered and not make them cylindrical. So what I'm going to do is take some thin metal and put it underneath the rod on the cutting side of the stones. So what's going to happen is it's going to make it larger on one end than the other. That way it's going to leave the taper on the spindle when I cut it. When I drill out the rod to make the replacement for the bearing, I'm going to need to make that tapered also. But I think I can do that without causing any problems. I was hoping to accomplish a lot more in this video, but I did learn some stuff and I'm going to keep thinking about this repair, and next week I am going to see what else I can get done. Thank you for watching. Look in the description below for links to related videos, and please subscribe for more band instrument repair videos.